Hello, I'm Brody Gregory, and I'm here today to explain muted group theory and how it relates to women in society. Muted group theory was first developed by anthropologists Edwin and Shirley Ardner in 1975. In his work on the idea, Edwin noted that women had used a uh, hard time properly expressing themselves using language devised from the male perspective. Um, The Ardners began their work on muted group theory in the late 1960s, mostly in Cameroon. According to Weston Turner, muted group theory explains what happens to people whose experiences or roles are not well represented by the verbal symbols in their language. Because languages were created by men, the words and ideas of those languages sometimes don't necessarily fit women's thoughts or feelings. And because these languages are not a proper fit for women, they often have a difficult time expressing themselves. And this often leads to women being thought of in many ways as too silent or too sheepish, too talkative, or even silly, and almost always less intelligent by society, especially men. While interviewing women of Cameroon, the Ardners found that they often began to giggle or act shy while answering their questions. This was likely because the women had been marginalized for so long, they themselves felt they were inferior to men. It turns out they only had difficulty expressing themselves using the language and ideas created by men without taking their perspective into account. Because these women had been marginalized for so long, they were hesitant to express their thoughts or needs. When women do express themselves and are vocal and assertive, they're often labeled combative, crazy, loud, obnoxious, or sometimes even pushy. The very effort to overcome this stigma is in of itself an attempt to mute their voices. Um, so, for most of human history, women have been marginalized and restricted by societies using things like language, social norms that were created by men. Um, I believe that most of us can think of a situation where women have been treated as less than equal by men in organizations. Their ideas and needs have been placed behind those of men, and women have all too often been considered inferior. Um, in the United States, during 1940s, women entered the workforce in numbers never seen before. This was due to the huge numbers of men um, leaving to fight during World War II. Women had to step in and fill roles traditionally held by men to keep the supply chain running, to support the war effort, and to support everyone else that was left at home. Um, Despite the spectacular job these women did during this time, the male dominant attitude returned with the end of the war and the return of men to the workplace. Once again, their voices were silenced and their participation was diminished. Um, Although the intent of these men may not have been to intentionally mute women's thoughts and contributions, um, they nevertheless feared for their jobs and refused to change the course of history. uh, Shoshana Luce said in 2005 that unions during the 19th century were focused most solely on white men. They had very little desire to improve conditions for women or non-white men because they felt this would only take away jobs from the white men whom they were composed of. This, among other beliefs, led to pay inequalities for women and minorities during post World War II America. A World Labor Review Board was established to look at this issue, but was soon disbanded and the issue was dropped. The committee found reasons for legislative change to protect the voices and rights of women, but failed to take hold to initiate progress. Of the women who entered the workforce during the 1940s and 1950s, over half stopped working after the war's end. To this day, many companies in America still remain male dominated. The women who did remain in or who entered the workforce were once again marginalized by the same ideas of the muted group theory. They were led to take jobs segregated out as women's jobs, things such as textile workers, secretaries, nurses, or even midwives. During the 1960s and 1970s, feminism and women's rights movements began. Feminism speaks to the overall rights of women, whereas muted group theory talks in terms of the right to speak. While there are many methods to mute groups, Shiris Kremere explains that language etiquette is a man-made construction, which means that language is created by man for man. This creates a gap in communication ability for women. However, there is optimism that this muted group can continue to make strides in closing the gender gaps. Claudia Golden said in 1991 that it is not likely that the increase during the war period will be a complete exception to the rule, that a generation of women which once adopts a greater degree of participation in gainful employments tends to retain that characteristics throughout its potential working life. Transition to changes in these discriminations under the muted group theory were instituted by the passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1963 Equal Pay Act. However, even with the mountains of evidence of equality, there still exists a gender bias from this muted group theory. So how do we end muting groups based on non-male language or customs? Some of the things that we could help to overcome this gap are continuous changes to our language with the creation of updated terms that lead to more inclusion or terms that come from a non-male or non-white perspective. Educators can play a huge role in strengthening the voices of women or minorities and overcoming biases to unmute their groups. As Pace stated in 1996, some teachers discount the notion of gender bias and assume that in their classes gender is not an issue. If they can learn to listen to their students, they may discover that verbalization is not necessarily synonyms with learning. In closing, I'd like to say that even though we continue to struggle with the equality of sexes in our society, it is incumbent on each of us to continue to identify causes of those inequalities. We must find and promote new ways for those muted groups to create a voice of their own and use the voices to take their equal footing into the future. Even though it is integrated into many cultures that women are not of equal stature or worth to men, they must persevere. They must continue the efforts of all who came before them during the women's rights movements of past decades to further women's progress and eliminate the muting of their group.